It's been 3 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. Is there finally peace at hand under the Trump administration, and at what cost? We'll address that in just a minute here on the Scott Sands Show.
It's a Scott Sands Show.
We're doing audio only today because my guest wasn't able to connect to a Zoom video, which is fine. In all honesty, I'm not a big fan of being on camera anyway. But it's a brave new world as we dive into episode 2537 of the Scott Sands Show. Thanks for finding me on Facebook, the Scott Sands Show, on X at Scott Sands Media, and of course here on YouTube as well. I'll be on other platforms this week. Thanks to sponsors like 4GuysInARoof.com, RixaHealth.com, formerly Revive Health. I'm down 100 pounds. Trying to get down another 25 more before the summer. I think I can do it too. Farnsworth Cocktail Bar in Waterville, Alches, and all of our sponsors. I want to hit on a couple of other stories before we get into, or at least one story, before we get to our guest, Commander Kirk Lippold, and we'll talk about 3 years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. First story up is the health of Pope Francis, who has been in the hospital with double pneumonia for more than a week now and is in critical condition. We're continuing to pray for the Holy Father and keep an eye on the intrigue in the Vatican if he were to pass, but he has been reportedly in good spirits. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out today. The other big story from the weekend was an email that DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, reportedly sent over the weekend to every federal employee. It was a simple email from the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, that said, please reply to this email with approximately 5 bullets of what you accomplished last week and CC your manager. Please don't send any classified information, links, or attachment. Deadline is Monday at midnight. So that's due today. Some departments have pushed back on the requirement to reply to that email. But I posted this on Facebook over the weekend and don't really have a problem with this. And I was surprised at a couple of responses. Overwhelmingly, many of you on Facebook support, being accountable for doing your job and finding some accomplishments in your work during the past week. In the private sector, look, for the last 10 years, and really longer than that, since I've had a job, I've been accountable to a superior manager along the way. And at iHeartMedia, I had to send weekly 15.5 reports. There's actually a website, it's 15.5.com, that compiles these reports. 5 questions. You're supposed to take 15 minutes out of your week to answer these 5 questions. Basically, what did you accomplish? What problems are you encountering in your job? What's the strategy moving forward? And I don't understand the pushback from especially Democrats right now who don't believe that the people who work for us, the taxpayers, should be held to the same level of accountability. One of the responses I got from a longtime friend who I've known for 20, 25 years, her reply was, for someone who has recently downsized and found yourself along with hundreds of coworkers across the country unexpectedly unemployed, I'm really disappointed to see this is how you're choosing to cover the fact that thousands of Americans are going through something you just dealt with. I know we haven't talked in years, and I'm starting to understand why. Goodbye. So the first thing that caught my attention, because I've got tremendous respect for her and like her personally, and I'm disappointed that we're at this point in our country where political differences of opinion are driving apart friendships and relationships. And that's the first thing that really disappointed me, and the fact that she blocked the ability for me to reply. I haven't gone to look to see if she has unfriended me. Very well may have. Disappointed that I can't reply to her. And I want to say that, first of all, is that you can disagree with me all you want. I'm not going to dislike you or hate you because you disagree with a political opinion of mine. And the second point is, we can certainly debate whether or not Elon Musk and Doge is the appropriate party for these responses to go to. Should Doge be the one evaluating employee performance? We can debate that. And certainly I think to a degree, Doge has gone into the federal government with a machete instead of a scalpel to find waste, fraud, and abuse. But they are finding waste, fraud, and abuse to an astonishing degree. And our government, the bureaucracy, the number of federal employees, and certainly our federal spending has gotten so out of control that something's got to be done. And if Elon Musk, if Doge breaks a few eggs in the process, we can fix that. We can go back and put that money back in. But let's cut it first and say, hey, why are we spending this much money on these frivolous initiatives? And why do we have so many people not coming into work and possibly not doing their job? Let's first of all find out if these 3 million federal employees are actually doing their job. What are they doing? What value are they bringing for the money that we're paying them as a federal employee? 3 million federal employees costing us as taxpayers about $270 billion a year, an average salary of $106,000 a year. What value are you bringing me for the salary we are paying you? And if that report, if that 15.5 goes to their supervisor, hopefully that manager in the various departments and agencies will hold them accountable for performing their job to a satisfactory level. If they don't, then those managers need to be held accountable by someone, OPM, by Doge, by the White House, by the Trump administration. I think this should be a fully transparent government without the classified information, of course. What have you done? Put that all on a website. Let's see what these federal workers and these agencies are doing every week. Why are we paying you? I would love to see the same level of transparency and accountability from some of our elected officials. I saw many Democrat Congress members, senators replying with some ridiculous answers. But in all seriousness, what are 5 things that you did as an elected official for your constituents last week? That's information I think we as voters deserve to know. And sure, we can debate whether or not these reports should be going up to Doge and Elon Musk to evaluate their employment, but they need to be held accountable. You can agree or disagree. I'd love to read your comments and hear your thoughts on that on Facebook or X at Scott Sands Media. Please forgive Tiger, the cat producer, who is now sneezing in the background of this message. As we head into the spring, if your roof has any damage from all of the snow and ice this winter, get an estimate, find out what repairs can be made, or get your roof fully replaced in as little as 1 day. That's why they are the extreme roofer, 4guysandaroof.com. Call Jamie and Mike, and they can get an estimate out to you quickly and using the latest technology, too. 4guysandaroof.com. It has been 3 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. There may finally be peace at hand. Donald Trump is pushing peace talks. Let's get into that with my guest this afternoon. It's Commander Kirk Lippold, former commander of the USS Cole, now president of Lippold Strategies, and you can find him online, kirklippold.com. Commander, as always, it's great to have you on. Thank you for your time.
Glad to be back on, Scott.
So the conflict in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is now 3 years past. Are you surprised this conflict has lasted as long as it has?
I am surprised because, quite frankly, the United States, coupled with our European allies, should have not done what President Biden did. And that is, from the very beginning, we should have given them the weapons and the armament they needed when they asked for it to be used in a matter of months, especially after President Zelensky, with fearless leadership, organized that nation, put them on a war footing, and pushed them back from a disastrous first few weeks of the invasion. So, quite honestly, it has dragged on far too long, and President Trump is absolutely right to try and figure out how to bring it to a peaceful conclusion, but Russia must be held accountable.
I think Ukraine stunned the world in their ability to resist the Russian invasion and hold off Vladimir Putin as long as they have. And you're absolutely right. I think America and our allies should have come to their defense and protected their sovereignty. But throwing money at the country, I think, has been one of the biggest problems many Americans have had throughout the past 3 years. You're right. We should have provided them with ammunition, arms, hard support, and training. And I think there's been a lack of transparency as to where some of this money has gone. And unlike many other conservatives, I think we should continue to support Ukraine. I think it sends a horrible message if we abandon them or broker a really bad peace deal at this time.
I think you're absolutely right, Scott. I think that, President Trump inherited a bag of you-know-what. And quite honestly, he is trying to make the best of what is a bad situation. But at this point in time, Ukraine has proven it. I mean, recently, let's face it, the United States gave grants of all this weaponry in the billions and billions of dollars to Ukraine, along with cash to be able to continue to support a government that has gone on to a wartime footing, not an economic footing to make a nation function. So, yes, we need to get an audit at some point and track it. But our European allies were actually much smarter than the Biden administration in the fact that they said, kind of like a lend-lease, we're going to give you this, but we're going to expect to be repaid at some point. I think that's why the Trump administration is very wise in trying to negotiate this critical and rare earth minerals deal with Ukraine that not only pays us back, but gives the United States an opportunity in coordination with Ukraine to develop those resources so that they have the opportunity to put money into their economy, to rebuild their nation, and to create a future for the Ukrainian people once the conflict has come to a conclusion at the peace table.
President Trump has been blaming Volodymyr Zelensky for the lack of a peace deal. Is Zelensky to blame for this?
Absolutely not. And I think it is very unfortunate that President Trump has somewhat fallen under the spell of Russian disinformation, because at the end of the day, Zelensky was duly elected and he is not a dictator. Number two, Russia chose to initiate this war. They chose to do that. Number three, Putin is a murderous, brutal war criminal, and he should be held account to it. And at the end of the day, President Trump should not fall into the trap where he is trying to rehabilitate Russia just because they have nuclear weapons. At the end of the day, Putin needs to be held accountable, and those hundreds of billions of dollars that are in banks around the world that are under sanctions and being held, a lot of that money should also be used to help rebuild Ukraine. But at the end of the day, the one thing Ukraine needs more than anything else is a security guarantee that whatever their borders end up being after this conflict, we will protect them along with Europe. We cannot afford another failed President Clinton security assurances where Europe and the United States did nothing in 2014 and then did very little with constraints in 2022 when the invasion started.
We're talking to Commander Kirk Lippold, former commander of the USS Cole, now President Lippold Strategies, kirklippold.com. Commander, let's talk about security for Ukraine moving forward and the fact that President Trump has called Zelensky a dictator. Today, surrounded by allies on the third anniversary of the Russian invasion, Zelensky has said, if you're ready for me to leave my post, I'm ready, or I can trade this for NATO membership if those conditions exist immediately. Should we consider granting Ukraine status inside NATO?
Consider it, yes. Whether it becomes a reality, that's a pretty thorny problem, because for years that's been a red line for Russia and needs to be taken into consideration at the negotiating table. Because one of the things that President Putin needs to be made to understand is he started this war. He behaved in violation of international law during this war. He has continued to engage in acts that are unacceptable in what he has done. So consequently, he can come to the table to negotiate in good faith, which I don't believe he will. But by the same token, he needs to clearly understand that there will be consequences and penalties for the actions of what he did and what his country did to Ukraine.
Some of the deals, some of the points in a possible peace deal outlined by the Trump administration include no return to pre-2022 or even 2014 boundary lines for Ukraine. Is that compromising their sovereignty? We're letting Russia redraw maps by force. Where does that end? Is this appeasing Putin?
Well, I think it was a very unfortunate couple of statements there by Secretary of Defense Hegseth before we really got started with the negotiations. It is continuing to be unfortunate that National Security Advisor Waltz does not recognize and admit upfront when asked by Maria Bartiromo this weekend if Russia was the aggressor and started this conflict. So I think that there's a desire to kind of try and shape the information warfare domain, the public perception, to get Russia and Ukraine to the negotiating table. And once there, then we begin the hard-nosed, who's willing to give up what and do what, and what are the penalties and rewards going to be. My greatest fear coming out of this is Russia initiates a conflict and gains territory, and there aren't consequences. Because what's going to happen in the South China Sea when China pushes against not Taiwan, which they want to do anyway, but pushes against an ally of ours in the Philippines? Do we allow them to seize more islands like they've done with the militarized islands, the 9-dash lines throughout the South China Sea, and then in order to get them to stop, we give them those islands? We can't afford to reward aggressive military behavior by rogue nations, whether it's Russia, China, Iran, or others.
And this is one of the things I've talked about quite a bit on the show in dealing with international affairs, is that America is often short-sighted in protecting our own interests. We think in terms of 2 years or 4 years, when another leader could easily come along after the next election and change America's foreign policy. Russia, China are thinking not 2 or 4 years in the future, but 50, 100, 200 years down the road. And this is a dangerous precedent to set, in my opinion.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that I've kind of laughed about for years, unfortunately, is we get all these people that want to talk about a rules-based world order. And yet when those very rules get broken, what do? Nothing. They stand back, wring their hands. Oh, they'll pass a measure at the United Nations. They'll condemn. They'll send a demarche over there diplomatically, telling him that was an unfortunate decision you made to do that. But the reality of it is, if you're going to have a rules-based order, you have rules and consequences. And when nations break them, you punish them. And the fact that we haven't done that truly indicates us that we never really had a rules-based world order to begin with, because you had nations like the United States and Europeans that were unwilling or didn't have the moral and ethical courage to enforce those rules. That has to stop, and there need to be consequences going into the future, because let's face it, we're a nation that is built on a set of values that should be an example to the world, not a reference point for how not to behave.
And that's one of the very reasons why America, I think, should be leading these peace talks, but we can't do it unilaterally. We must involve Europe, and we certainly need to involve President Zelensky. Leaving him out of the peace talks, I think, is a major strategic mistake.
I think Europe needs to be involved, but I think at the end of the day, what Europe needs to realize is that now for decades, the United States has failed the American people in the world by not making Europe live up to their treaty commitments under NATO and supply the 2% GDP, which President Trump, I know, wants to take to 5%. But at the end of the day, we need to make them realize, look, you want to be responsible for your security, you want to have a say in what's going on, then you need to live up to your commitments as well.
Commander,
so it is time for Europe. It's just time for Europe to start realizing that if you want to have a leadership role on your continent in the future, then step up.
I think you and I agree, Commander. It's not just about Ukraine. It's about global order and standing up to tyranny. I think we need to engage with resolve to protect not just Ukrainian sovereignty, but the very principles of international law and order.
Absolutely. And look, guess what, Scott? We've got 4 instruments of national power: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. Military is the tool of last resort. All the others need to be exercised before we do it. There can be a lot of sanctions that can be put in place. There can be economic penalties and rewards that can be put into place. We need to call out the information warfare domain and make sure that the truth is being told, because there's a lot of disinformation out there that is put on the web, especially by the Russians, who are experts at it, along with Iran. And at the end of the day, when you use those instruments of national power, you get the world order that we need, and you can have peace so that economies can grow and prosper and nations can take care of their people, which is ultimately, I think, what President Trump wants. But you have to do it from a position of strength and demand that other nations live up to those values and those standards.
I think the Trump administration has missed the boat on some of these pressures, diplomatic pressures that could be put on Vladimir Putin. We need to push for more sanctions, not just on Russia, but on any nation aiding them right now.
I think you're absolutely right. And that includes China and North Korea. The bottom line is we got so intertwined economically with China that they somewhat got us in a compromising position at the end of the day. You just have to have an honest conversation with the American people and say, look, economically, this is going to hurt, but this is the benefit that we gain into the future by doing this and holding China accountable, even though it could cause problems with inflation, with prices going up on material that comes from China, on the fact that we need to reshore industries back into the United States rather than pushing them there elsewhere in the world. But you're right. We need to hold those nations accountable.
I talk to a couple of friends in Ukraine regularly, and I think the people of Ukraine certainly want peace, but not at the detriment of their sovereignty and the long-term impact on their people. They certainly do not want to fall under Russian rule, Russian control, and I'm concerned about any sort of appeasement that this peace talk may provide Vladimir Putin moving forward. Commander, how do you think this plays out from now? I think we're all surprised that we're talking about it 3 years later, but how do these peace talks, how does the conflict play out now?
I think the President Trump is going to make a best faith effort to get both Russia and Ukraine to the negotiating table first, get them at least started talking, and then bring in the Europeans who have to live with that as in right next door, the consequences of that agreement. And I think that you will see it. But you also have to remember, when it comes to conflict, your enemy gets a vote. And right now, Putin is going to be weighing what he stands to gain and lose by coming into these negotiations. President Trump may want them. President Putin is going to try and angle for as much as he can. Ukraine has done a phenomenal job. I mean, let's face it. Ukraine has changed the face of warfare on land for every single nation. They, to a degree, have changed it for anyone that has a seashore where ships may come in, because look at what they were doing in the Black Sea itself. So the bottom line is Ukraine has changed, and they have also become a symbol of resolve for nations around the world on how to behave when they get attacked. And trust me, it is serving as a source of inspiration for the Taiwanese very quietly right now, and the Philippines that are having to face up to China aggression. So I think at the end of the day, we need to stop making foolish statements like calling Zelensky a dictator, that they started the war, that they could have resolved it several years ago. Look, those decisions are all in the past. We need to look at where we are now and figure out how do we get people to the negotiating table, and then figure out what are going to be the best terms for long-term peace and security for Ukraine with guarantees, and then the European continent and the world after that.
And throughout the entire process, I think we need to protect America's credibility as well as NATO's credibility. If we back out now, we can't really expect our allies to trust us in the future. And it's not just, as I said at the beginning, about money. We've got a responsibility to lead and not just follow or fund from the sidelines.
Absolutely. And I think that is going to be critical, is that U.S. credibility to back our fellow nations in a fight for freedom is paramount, because people look at us as still that shining beacon on the hill that President Reagan talked about. And we should serve as that example. But you have to have the moral courage. You have to make ethical decisions, and you need to make sure that our values are still held high. But you do it in a manner that also makes other nations live up to their commitments like the Europeans should.
Commander, I know this is going to be a broad question, but while I've got you here, you and I have talked many times in the past about rebuilding America's naval strength and rebuilding America's military. How do you see the direction under Pete Hegseth moving forward and the Trump administration in rebuilding America's military strength?
I think what you're going to see with Secretary of Defense Hegseth and President Trump is a reorientation of the Department of Defense to get away from the standard military-industrial complex where everyone just gets comfortable with the status quo and we're going to build. We had a nation that, despite Ciano Franchetti's best efforts, there were too many people that she had to fight against, and consequently the Navy was getting smaller and smaller. The Navy fundamentally is different from the Army and the Air Force that can put boots on the ground and bombs on target in less than 24 hours. A Navy has to have not only capability, but quantity that can be forward deployed to stay there. It takes us weeks sometimes to get to where we need to be in the world. We can no longer afford not to have the larger Navy that we have. And we need to expand our shipyards. We need to start building it out because let's face it, for years we told the trades, hey, if you don't have a college education, you don't have what it takes to succeed. Well, look at plumbers, electricians, welders, all those things that now have to build the military for the future, and they're not available. We're competing with private industry, so it's going to be a challenge. But at the end of the day, I think they're going to reorient the Department of Defense based on lessons learned coming out of Ukraine and elsewhere. They're going to start turning to some of the smaller contractors that have more innovation and ideas that you can take a stick at. And the big defense contractors better learn to be nimble because they're going to start falling behind if they don't.
Commander Kirk Lippold and now President Lippold Strategies, kirklippold.com. As always, great to have a conversation with you, sir.
Scott, as always, thoroughly enjoy it, and thank you to your listeners.
He's Commander Kirk Lippold, former commander of the USS Cole, now President Lippold Strategies. You can find him online at kirklippold.com. It's the Scott Sand Show, the podcast version. Thanks for finding us. Please be sure to click subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to us this afternoon. And thanks to one of our sponsors, one of our new sponsors, Alp Pouches. If you use nicotine patches, you got to try Alp. It's a better time. It's the company Tucker Carlson founded. And in fact, I'll put a link online on my social media where you can get 10% off your first purchase if you buy through my link. It must be 21 or over. Nicotine is an addictive chemical, but they are so much better than some of the other alternatives out there. You got to try the Alp Pouches. Let's talk for a second about some of the madness coming out of Columbus. Governor Mike DeWine's got a new plan to fleece Ohio taxpayers and prop up billionaire NFL owners. And this time it's all about funneling your hard-earned money into a shiny new dome for the Cleveland Browns. How's he going to do it? By jacking up the sports betting tax and redirecting that money. So let me break down and expose why I think it's a bad deal for Ohioans. First off, DeWine's budget doubles the sports gaming tax on operators from 20% to a whopping 40%. That's quadrupling of the rate since legal betting kicked off 2 years ago at just 10%. DeWine says this will rake in $150 million a year to help fund projects like the Browns' proposed move to Brook Park. But here's the rub. Why are we shaking down an industry to bail out a private business? The NFL is a multi-billion-dollar juggernaut. The Browns owners, the Haslams, can open their own wallets for once. DeWine says 98% of sports betting online run mostly by out-of-state companies, and Ohioans lost over $500,000 last year. So that's a fair point. Gambling is a cash vacuum, but if it's such a drain, why double down by hiking the tax and tying it into a stadium for the Browns? That $150 million isn't staying in Ohio. It's just a detour before it lands in the NFL's own coffers. Meanwhile, we as taxpayers are getting stuck with the bill for a dome most of us will never even step foot in. And let's talk about that tax hike. At 40%, Ohio's sports betting rate would be among the highest in the country. So what's that mean? Operators might just pack up and leave or jack up the cost for us, the bettors, everyday people who feel the squeeze. Small businesses tied to the industry could take a hit too. We're punishing a growing sector to fund a luxury playground for a football team that's been mid since the 90s, which I don't believe are great priorities, Governor DeWine, who admits Ohio's been coughing up cash for stadiums since 1970. Decades of taxpayer handouts, and now with the soccer team piling on, he says it's not going to stop. And here's where I draw the line. He wants to shift it off the general fund and onto this gambling tax scam, which is not a solution. It's a shell game. Whether it's from your income tax or a betting tax, it's still your money being siphoned off to pad the NFL bottom line. The Cleveland Browns don't need a taxpayer-funded dome. They need a better playbook. They need a better play caller. And Ohioans don't need taxes or rated revenue streams to make it happen. I think you should tell DeWine to ditch this plan and let the free market do its job. Billionaires can build their own stadiums, and I am tired of picking up the tab. Call your lawmakers, raise some hell. Let's keep Ohio's money where it belongs, in our pockets. That's episode 2537 of The Scott Sands Show. Again, please subscribe, follow me on Facebook, The Scott Sands Show, X at Scott Sands Media, and on YouTube. Soon to come on other platforms too, and I'd love to hear from you as well. Thanks for listening.